Why do you get so upset? Welcome, everyone, to the Cope and Chill podcast, where every Tuesday we explore practical approaches to self-care and self-healing for better emotional and mental health and well-being. I'm your host, Ron Martin. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching or listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you are listening via audio podcast, please leave us a comment. Doing these things will help our show to be heard and seen by more and more people and helps us to get better all the way around. This week we have Ben Winter, who is an author, speaker, actor, improvist, entrepreneur, traveler, father, and much, much more. He loves to explore physical places around the world, but also he loves to explore the mind. Ben is the author of the book, What to Expect When Having Expectations, using the anger of unmet expectations to find peace. You can find his book on Amazon and through our affiliate links in the show notes, or on Ben's website, havingexpectations.com. After first meeting Ben, I thought it would be great for our listeners to also meet him. He has a pretty interesting philosophy and approach to helping people explore the root of their anger and upset, work through it, and learn how to approach future situations with greater calm and ease. In this interview, Ben shares what he means by expectations, how they arise and present themselves in our lives, and why we become upset when our expectations aren't met. He also shares information about a tool he developed to help you work through your expectations and emotions in a cognitive way. This tool is available through his book, but is also available through his website for free. Ben is a really nice guy who was very generous with his time. The interview you're about to hear actually is the second interview I did with him, because the first one I had screwed up by misusing some of the technology used to produce the show. Oh well, we both felt that this interview you're about to hear was the better of the two. I really do appreciate you joining me to listen in, and please don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment wherever you're joining us from. Thank you. And now, here's Ben Winter. Hey everyone, welcome to the Cope and Chill podcast with Ron Martin. I'm here with Ben Winter. Ben is the author of the book, What to Expect When Having Expectations. And thank you for joining, Ben. I really appreciate you coming on, and I would love to start by having you tell us a bit about what your book is about, what the premise is, and how you came to write it.
Yeah, so the premise of the book really is about understanding our expectations, where they come from, why we have them, and then what to do when they rear their ugly head. So, and kind of the way that it came about was that I teach improv, and one of the things that I kept teaching in my improv classes was that the only reason anybody gets upset is because an expectation hasn't been met. And it was an interesting saying, but it didn't solve anything. It was just kind of like pointing out an obvious thing that once you say it, people are like, yeah, duh. And so I was like, let's solve this. And I sat down with a whiteboard, and I put "you're upset" at the very top. And then my first question always is, did you know you had an expectation? And I just sort of started working through this workflow of trying to find a resolution through it. And every time that I would say no, like, if I didn't know I had an expectation, or why I'm not sharing that expectation with somebody else. And there's a lot of depth behind those no's. Like, where did that expectation come from if I didn't even know I had it? That's something to explore. And then why don't I share my expectations? There's something to explore. And, just sort of kept going from there. And once the workflow was done, I was like, I probably need to dive into this and give the knowledge that I have rattling in my head out on paper so other people can also follow suit and figure out why they are, in fact, having these expectations in the first place.
So when we spoke before, I didn't ask you this question, but I'm curious. Did you share the workflow with any of your classes, any of the people you were teaching the improv to? And then what was their reaction, if you
Yeah,
did?
anybody I've ever shared the workflow with absolutely loves it. They want to take a picture of it, and I'm like, no, just download it, print it out. Here, take a you know copy that I have sitting right here, because I want people to remember that they have a choice when they get upset. So I'm happy to just give this workflow out to people. It's no big deal to me.
Okay. And you mentioned that this is downloadable from your website, but we'll talk about that
Sure.
later. But just for our audience to sort of bring them a bit more in on what we're talking about here, you talk about the flow chart that you've created. Maybe you can help them understand what would the using the flow chart do for someone? Why should they pick it up? What would they get out of using that flow chart?
Yeah, so I created it in order to go from a place of being upset to finding some level of peace with the expectation that's going unmet. Which is why I always start with the first question of, did you know you had the expectation? Because if you didn't even know you had the expectation, you can't be upset with the outcome. Because now you can take a step back and say, okay, where did this expectation come from that I didn't even know I had? And it allows you to create a level of awareness of that expectation. If you already knew you had it, maybe it's that you haven't shared it. So why haven't you shared it? And it just keeps asking these questions and bringing up points that somebody can kind of look at and become aware of, and ultimately find a level of peace with it. Because the sooner we get from being unhappy and angry or whatever to a point of being at peace again, then we're happy. And don't we all want to be happy more than we want to be upset? Most people would say yes to that. So if anything, I created it as a guide to move people through the process just a little bit faster.
And you're not saying that people wouldn't get upset. And also, it sounds like, because you're saying that people don't necessarily know where their expectations are come from on its surface, they just kind of happen. So it's not like you're preventing the upset, but you're adding a level of skill that could help you work through or maybe get ahead of some upset in the future. Is that fair? Or
It's a bit of both. I mean, for the most part, yes, it's an exercise after you get upset. It's that moment in time you're upset. Now you got to work through it. Here's a tool that you can pull out of your toolbox to move from being upset to not. At the same time, the more you practice such a thing, the faster you catch yourself. So maybe in the future, you find that you're upset for 2 seconds rather than 2 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days. And that's where people have to remember, you're starting from somewhere. And if you're usually upset for days, you might look at this and be upset for half the time. And then the next time, half a day. And then, maybe half an hour. And then finally, it rears its ugly head again. And you're like, oh, I've already solved this one. I'm good. And
Yeah.
just,
So if you're encountering something similar in the future and you've already kind of worked through in your head how to sort of approach that in a more balanced way, then you sort of have this template that you can work through in your head to kind of help you be more successful with it.
yeah. I mean, the example I always use is traffic. Like, I always get upset at traffic, and I would take my entire commute in being just really angry and upset at everyone and everything. And now it's, a couple seconds of, yeah, that was incredibly stupid to watch. And we're back to where we are, and it is
Right.
what it is. And I've already worked through this so many times that I know it's not worth being upset. And then I just kind of continue on with my drive. Um, so it works. It
Yeah.
it it does help. But unfortunately, since a lot of the times we get upset is due to an expectation we didn't even know we had,
Mm-hmm.
there's really no way to prevent that.
Mm-hmm.
At least not from this standpoint. Now, there's other things you can do. I know you talk about mindfulness and personal growth and other things that would actually bring awareness to your thought processes before they occur. But this is kind of one of those things where you're inevitably going to find something else out about yourself. I mean, I've
Mm-hmm.
been doing personal growth work for 20 years now, and I keep learning about myself. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
we age, we get to a different point in our life that we're going to have different expectations.
Yeah.
we're just going to find out about them as we go. So it's a non-stop process, if you
I
will.
think that's right. I think we are on a journey. We all are on a journey to continuously learn about ourselves, especially if we're open, right? There's always something more new to learn, something that's more that's revealed that we may not have noticed, or maybe it's been revealed before, but we see it from a different angle. We have a different perspective on it. But just again, for our audience's sake, because we talked a lot about expectations, maybe we can define for them what we mean by expectations. And I think when you and I talked before, you defined it as a belief that something is going to happen, an expected outcome. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about that.
So we all have the belief that something's going to happen in the future. And the easiest way to say that is when you wake up in the morning, you expect hot water in the shower. You expect your refrigerator to be running. You expect to be able to wake up with your alarm and leave when you expect to leave. These are just things that are built up over time as a belief system. We don't have to talk about religion here. We can just talk about general beliefs about how the world works.
Mm-hmm.
You wake up, you get ready, you go to work, you come home, or whatever else you do during the day. There's the belief that it's going to happen. You're going to get in your car and it's going to turn on. You're not going to have to need to get gas, and your car's going to run out of gas before you even get down the street, right? These are things that we think about, or don't think about, I should say, on a daily basis. And that's just kind of what our expectations are. So now, if you grew up in a household where everybody was kind and generous and caring to one another, and you go out into the world and you see somebody who's not kind and generous, you're kind of angry about it. You're like, what's their problem?
It can be a bit of a shock too. I know I had something like
Absolutely.
that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, if you're leaving the house for the first time and going to college and you're not used to how other people are, I don't know how you'd make it that long, but
I did.
let's just say you led a very sheltered life until
I did.
college.
Yeah.
It's going to be a very shocking experience
Yeah.
going into college. Um, Vice versa. If you grow up in a very angry and uncaring household and everybody's always upset with one another, and you meet somebody who's kind and generous, you're going to be like, yeah, when are they going to stab me in the back? Right. You now have the expectation that they're going to screw you over. And when they don't, you get upset about it because you're like, that this doesn't make sense. That's not the way the world is supposed to work.
Or maybe
if
you live like that, you might try to provoke them to behave in that way because you expect it, right?
Exactly.
That's the way your world was when you were growing up. So maybe you expect everyone to be like that. And if they're not showing up like that, you may try to provoke them.
Exactly. And that's just kind of how our subconscious works when we're growing up, as we get these belief systems in place. We didn't come out of the womb knowing how to use a fork. Right. We learn how to use a fork and a spoon. A kid using a spoon is using like the hand like this. When you're an adult, you do some nuanced stuff with your fingers or whatever. Whatever. You learn over time how to use a fork. And if you're eating food and all of a sudden you stab yourself in the face accidentally, you're a little upset about it because you're like, I should know how to use a fork and not miss my mouth, right? So there's just another example of a belief that I know how to use a fork.
Or I guess as you're explaining that, I think about like, how many times I bit my cheek, the inside of my cheek, and it's like, and then you're kind of angry that you bit the inside, and then you're hurt also at the same time, and it's like, how did that happen? So also when we talked before, you mentioned, and you kind of talk about it in maybe in an implied way through the examples you've just given, is that the way life works is that you probably have expectation after expectation after expectation as you live, from moment to moment. It may not be necessarily something that you're aware of, but if you have a series of upsets, maybe some are more prominent than others. I guess the question becomes is, how do you know where to focus? How would you use your workflow to determine where to focus if you've got a lot going on in your life?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because expectations aren't linear. They're not just like one at a time. Usually it's like an onion and there's just layer after layer. So I think it just becomes a practice that you have to take on, where once you recognize you're upset, you may say, did I know I had this expectation? And did I know I had this expectation and this expectation? When somebody's late to a meeting,
Mhm.
A, you might have expected them to be on time, or B, expected them to text you that they're running late, or C, apologize that they're late, or, you know, any number of things around somebody being late. There's a lot of expectations there. Um, and some people have that friend where you just expect them to be late. And
Mhm.
then it becomes a game of how late are they going to be. And then when they don't show up, you're like, what? I mean, now you're really upset. You're like,
Right.
not only were you late, but you didn't even show up and you didn't say anything about it.
Or
So,
if they show up on time or early, then you're pleasantly surprised. You're kind of like blown away, like, wow,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
which is
Unless you
another
were
form of
planning on them
expectation.
being late
Yeah.
and you're just like, no, you just screwed up everything. you know,
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
there goes your surprise party.
Yeah. Right.
Jeez. Right.
Yeah.
But that's just it, is you kind of sometimes have to work with them in tandem. Sometimes there is one that's way more obvious than the others, and that's the one to focus on because that's the biggest one. And sometimes it's easier to deal with the small ones first and then take the giant elephant expectation that was just staring you in the face behind all the other ones. um because we live in a weird world where people are late all the time. So if it's really that bothersome, what happened to you in your youth, where you created the expectation of being on time,
Mhm.
and what happened when you weren't? Like, was there some, like, did you get in trouble with your parents?
Mm.
um you know I grew up in a time where there were spankings and stuff. So right,
Yeah.
you do
Yeah.
something wrong and you
Yeah.
get spanked for it.
Yeah.
There's times people get it way worse. They get a belt, stuff like that.
Hmm.
So it wasn't so much about being late as it was, I'm going to get hurt
Yes. Yeah.
by doing what's going against what's expected of me.
Sure.
So here you are as an adult, and somebody else is late. You now have this like PTSD happening that you don't even realize is happening around this expectation. And so that could be the issue. It's not that they're late, you're just experiencing what you did as a kid because you were late, coming home from whatever. So
Yeah. 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 So we've previously talked about the notion at another time of expectations being very much, or actually the same as boundaries and judgments. And
mhm.
I added the piece about because going through my own sort of cognitive therapy experience, I learned a lot about shoulds, right? And shoulds, it's a form of judgment, but it's essentially where you say I should do that, or I should have done that, or my kid should have done that. And so there's a lot of pressure put on the situation with a should, because should is what it says it is. It means that it was supposed to happen that way. And when it did it, it inherently implies that you're going to be disappointed, upset, whatever, because it didn't turn out the way that you wanted. So talk to us about how these are all the same thing. So when we say expectations not having been met, and they're the same as boundaries being violated, or judgments, or shoulds, what's the connection there?
I think you kind of spelled it out pretty well, is that they're all the same thing, just a different word. If you
Mhm.
think of a boundary that somebody doesn't respect, um, prime example, a woman says no, or even a man
Mhm.
says no,
Mhm.
to an advancement or something.
Yeah.
And the person doesn't respect that. Well, you might have had the expectation that they would actually listen to the words coming out of your
Yeah.
mouth
Mhm.
and honor those. That's
Mhm.
a boundary. They should have known better,
Mhm.
right? That's an expectation that
Yeah.
they're actually aware of what they are expected. It's an expectation we put on somebody else. When we should on somebody,
Mhm.
we're basically saying they should know my expectation that I have for them.
And let's
Except
be
did
clear,
we?
you said should on somebody, SHOULD, right?
Yes, should on
Yeah.
them.
The way
You
it
should.
sounded, but I know what you were saying.
Yeah, when you should on somebody, let's enunciate that one. So, uh, you're putting an expectation on them, whether they know it or not. And it goes back to that question: have you shared your expectation?
Mm,
So when you should on somebody,
mhm,
you basically have to tell them, like, hey, I'm putting this expectation on you. Now they may agree to it, they may not, but that's a conversation. That's coming up with a contract. It could just be a verbal contract, but a contract is a set of expectations that are known.
Yeah.
You sign a document that's a contract. Well, you know what to expect if you don't pay the bill, if you find something after the sale is done, whatever it might be, it's all spelled out in that document. So those are known expectations that you agreed to because you signed it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, judgments, how we look at people and situations, uh, again, those come from our youth. If
Mm-hmm.
our parents always saw somebody with tattoos and being on a
Yeah.
motorcycle as a
Dangerous.
gangster,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
or somebody who's just going to cause trouble and
Yeah.
shoot things, then you're going to grow up thinking everybody on a motorcycle has a gun.
Yeah. Yeah. They're dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, they're dangerous, and that's what a judgment is. That's an expectation. You now have an expectation of motorcyclists because of how you grew up. Now, one of the questions I always ask is your expectation reasonable?
Mm.
And in that example, it's not, because there's
Mm-hmm.
plenty of people that ride motorcycles that
Yeah.
have nothing to do with guns at
That's
all.
right. Right.
I'm one of them. I have a
Yeah.
motorcycle. I don't have a gun.
Yeah.
Just
Well,
what
it's
is
a
it?
form of prejudice, right? I mean, you're prejudging the person based on the way that they look or what have you, which I guess is another form of expectation, or if you think about it, right?
Yeah, prejudice and judgment. It's all this.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same boat.
Yeah. 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 Same world. Same world.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the workflow that you've created, and it's something that is downloadable and available for people. But what I wanted to get into, because I think you in one of your examples previously, I think it was the one where you talked about being in traffic. You said, you were able to kind of rifle through the workflow in your head. And for those of you that are watching this on YouTube, you could see that he kind of looked up and then he was kind of going through the workflow in his head, and you went through it pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I want to ask is that, or maybe point out to people, is you can use this as a tool to learn how to get familiar with the process, but it doesn't always have to be that way, right? It's something that people could eventually become so familiar with and so comfortable with that they could literally rifle through it in their head, much like you did.
Yeah, it's just another tool that people can use, and you use a tool enough, it just becomes second nature, and that's the beauty of it. So,
but if you're using it for the first time, what would one expect from the experience of using it for the first time? Is it this lengthy, in-depth kind of process, or do you think it's something that people could get through in a few minutes, or what do you think they should expect?
I think it's something that people should look at. I'm shitting on people. I think it's something that would be beneficial to look at when you're not in an angry and upset situation, so that you have a reminder when you are upset. Hey, I've got this thing I can go look at. Then you're reminded that you have this thing. Once you're there and you're upset, you're not going to go from upset to let me go grab this thing. It's going to take you a little bit of time to calm down enough to remember. However, then, maybe you've yelled at somebody and you've gone to your room and here it is sitting it's on the wall and you can take a look at it, or it's sitting next to your bed and you can look at it. That's kind of one of those moments in time where you can then breathe for a second. You can look at it and say, where am I on this thing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did I just yell at my partner and I didn't even know I had the expectation?
Mm-hmm.
Or did I yell at my partner and I hadn't even shared my expectation?
Mm-hmm.
Did they even agree to the expectation? And if you didn't know you had it and you didn't share it, then there's no way they could agree.
Right.
And hopefully you're going to come to some realization that if you didn't even know you had it and you didn't share it, that it's not reasonable yet for anybody else to have bought in, because
Mm-hmm.
nobody else is a mind reader.
Mm-hmm.
And just because they did something before that was similar doesn't mean they're going to do that again, because you haven't shared that expectation. So maybe you'll be able to take a step back and go apologize and say, you know what? I didn't even know I had an expectation. Let's talk through it.
As a parent of 3 kids, as I hear you talking about this, it seems like it would also be a very good tool to use as a parent to help you develop a bit more patience, right? And come to that realization that even though you may be upset because your kid did something or didn't do something that you thought they should do, there's that should word.
Yep.
But this might help you maybe take a step back and reflect on whether or not you've communicated those expectations appropriately at some point in time, so that it would be clear that they did know what you wanted them to do. Because maybe sometimes we assume that, or that they should know better, but they may not, because no one showed them.
Exactly. And I think that this is huge for parenting because kids are a clean slate. They don't know anything about this world.
Mm-hmm.
They know nothing. So when they're young, we are basically instilling the shoulds and the judgments and the expectations and the boundaries. You know, how early are we saying don't run into the street?
Yeah.
Stop at the edge of the sidewalk. Like, it doesn't
Or as
matter
you
if
said
you're
earlier,
bald.
eat your food with a fork instead of your fingers, which I've had
Yeah,
to do with my kids a number of times.
exactly. We are setting these expectations into our children. So if they're 3 years old and they're doing something you don't want them to do, or you think any grown person would know better, well, they're not a grown person.
Yeah.
They've never been in this situation.
Yeah.
You've never told them what to do or not to do.
Mm-hmm.
You've never set those boundaries or expectations or any of that information to them. So they're a clean slate. They're a blank canvas. So you get to choose as a parent on a day-to-day basis how you want to set those expectations up for your kid. You know, my son is 13 and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And he's, hitting puberty and the hormones and all this other stuff. And I have to check in with myself every time I want to have a conversation with him of like, am I asking him, or am I thinking of asking him something that is a prejudice, a bias? Is that going to set some sort of precedence in his mind by asking this question? And do I want to do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now, I'm able to do it pretty quickly because I'm aware that that's kind of what I want to do. And sometimes I'll say something and I'll be, oh, no, I didn't mean that. Got to go back and change it before it becomes a habit.
Right.
Like he's starting to date now. And, rather than going to the superficial, is she cute? It's like, what do you like about her?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is she good at talking?
Yeah.
Do you enjoy spending time with her? Like, I don't want it to be superficial and all about looks, because too much of that happens in our world today.
Yes, absolutely.
That if I, as the parent, can teach the better stuff, the stuff underneath the looks, the thing that makes the person a good human being and a good partner, that has nothing to do with how they look on the outside, then that's what I need to do.
Yeah. I think that's awesome. I mean, I'm sort of taking mental notes myself in terms, I have 3 girls. They're all the same age. I have triplet girls who are 11 years old. And I'm very much concerned about what I'm going to say about, when they start dating as well. And but I think that being conscious and aware of what you're going to say to them and being aware of your intent, as opposed to just being reactive. Like, I had a daughter tell me that she had a crush on somebody in the orchestra that stands next to him, and I was like, okay, I can feel something going on in my body. It's like, but I'm gonna trust her and believe that she's going to make smart choices as it relates to this person. So
yeah, it's a tough one, but that's the beauty of us being adults and having lived as much life, is that we can take a step back and say, do I need to instill my expectations onto my child? If they haven't served me, they're not going to serve my child. And or they will, in which case, yeah, I want to instill this. I want to teach you and instill in you of proper manners.
Yeah,
maybe not like super proper manners where you're like, hands in your laps and you take a bite with a fork and put the fork back down. I'm not, that's just unreasonable in today's world.
Yeah.
If you're going to sit down with dinner with like the president, sure. Okay. Learn the proper stuff, but you know what? You're not. So, just don't be a pig or anything like that. Put the napkin in your lap, sort of thing. But, there's plenty of things that I was raised with that don't serve my child, so I'm not going to bring them up to my child.
Yeah.
And And there are things that were never brought up to me that I want to bring up to my child. So it's a
Yes.
constant game of
Yes.
awareness
Yes.
and perception and checking in
It takes a
every
lot of
time.
mental energy to parent in a balanced way and a non-reactive way. It really does. So, and actually, along those lines, about not being reactive, right, and being more intentional in terms of how you approach. I think a common conversation point in today's environment is, the idea of being triggered, right? How could your workflow help with the idea of being triggered? How can it help us to perhaps not get so triggered, or how would they use that?
Well, I think the word triggered is synonymous with being upset.
Mm-hmm.
If you're triggered by something, that means you have some kind of visceral reaction to it. And being upset is a visceral reaction. So I think in that standpoint, you can say, why am I triggered? It's the same thing of why did I know I had this expectation? Why am I being triggered? It's kind of the same question. Where is this coming from?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can kind of go through the workflow in the same standpoint, because being triggered and being upset in my view, are the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
So
going through the workflow is essentially an act of self-reflection, right? It's a structured self-reflection that you can learn from, that you can build upon, and hopefully grow.
yeah,
Is that fair? Okay.
yeah, because I mean, some people will go and meditate. They'll take a walk. They'll do a bunch of other things to kind of reflect on what just happened.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just another tool in the toolbox as a way to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Okay.
I like to say that one of the, when Einstein said you can only solve problems at a different level than they're created, well, it could be that you just can't solve an emotional problem emotionally, and you have to solve it physically or mentally or spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just a mental process, because it's a workflow. It's, there's no emotion to it. It's simply questions you have to ask and answer. um,
But the
by
mental
meditating.
process, yeah, but the mental process can help you bring a cognitive element to the way to something you might ordinarily react to emotionally, right? It's
Exactly.
sort of balancing things out a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because usually reacting emotionally just brings up more yelling.
Yeah, right.
Either at yourself or the person you're with, or the car next to you, of
Yeah.
like, why did you do that?
Yeah, climb the emotional ladder. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one thing, and I've asked you this question before in our prior conversations, but I think it would be helpful for people to have an understanding of, again, it goes back to the definition of expectation, but really, a common phrase that's used in the business environment, the business world, is manage expectations, manage someone's expectations. So what's the difference between what you're suggesting and quote unquote managing expectations?
Yeah, it was interesting when this question was asked before. It kind of threw me off, but I like it. um what I think people use manage expectations at the wrong time with the wrong idea. And the way I look at it is, if you didn't even know you had the expectation, there's no way to manage it
Mm-hmm.
prior to you being triggered or you being upset.
Mm-hmm.
Once you're upset, then you can, in essence, through this process, manage that expectation for the future.
Mm-hmm.
So managing expectations is reactionary, because once you know about the expectation, then you can do something about it in the future. And in that stance, you're managing it. But if you just say, well, if you just manage your expectations, you'll never be upset. That's just impossible. Sorry. You're never going to be ahead of every expectation you will ever know in your entire life. It's literally not possible. Um,
So I mean, this helps you
yeah,
learn is what it does. And so to your point, it's like maybe you get to that place of being in managing expectations because you've learned from the prior experiences. You've done that self-reflection, or you've done that reflection of that interaction or what have you with that person, so that perhaps you can gain a better understanding of yourself and that person in that in a similar situation.
Yeah, and like I said, you'll go from that moment of being upset or triggered. I like that word actually. You'll go from that moment to being more or less at peace in a very short amount of time if you're constantly working on this process. Even if with new expectations, you'd be like, here I am again, new expectation. I know how quickly I can work through this now. All I have to do is take a minute, figure out where it's coming from. Does it still serve me after 30 years? You know, is today's world even going to work with this type of expectation? Um,
That's awesome. I
yeah,
love that. And I think that sums it up nicely. That's so very thoughtful perspective on how it can apply, to that situation.
yeah.
So Ben, I you shared a lot today. You shared a lot of great knowledge, a lot of great thinking, and you've got this tool that you've said is available to people for free, right?
Mhm.
And where would people go to find information from you? Where would they go to find this tool? Where would they go to find your book?
The fastest and easiest for all of that is going to my website, havingexpectations.com.
Havingexpectations.com. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll have a link to that in the show notes. But of course, if you're not able to find my show notes, which I hope you will at copeandchill.com, you can definitely go to Ben's website, havingexpectations.com. Awesome. Anything
Yeah.
else that you'd like to share? Any other parting pieces of advice or information?
Yeah, I always like to end with this is if everybody else is telling you don't get upset, stop getting upset, I say go ahead and get upset. My only suggestion is don't stay there because now you can treat getting upset as a trigger point for growth. If you choose to be upset, then that's just a victim mentality. If you choose to look at being upset as an opportunity for growth, that's the responsible mentality, and you can grow vastly and quickly by just taking that moment in time and saying, I'm upset. I might be able to learn something about myself right now.
I love that. I love that. Wise words, Ben. Wise words. Thank you so much again for joining us. Again, everyone, check out Ben's work at havingexpectations.com, and you've got that free download, the worksheet or the workflow that he mentioned earlier. And of course, you can access or buy his book through that same website. So, Ben, thanks again for being here. Really appreciate your time. You've been very generous, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good.
All right, take care. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you were able to take some inspiration or something of value from today's show. To access all of the resources and links mentioned, please head on over to copeandchill.com or our video-based podcast on our YouTube channel at Cope and Chill, where you will find the show notes for today's episode. That's Cope and Chill, CopeandChill.com. And for information about upcoming episodes, check us out on Instagram at Cope and Chill. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you're joining us from YouTube, and leave a comment wherever you're joining us from. Please come back and join us again for next week's episode. But until then, take care of yourselves.